The obese girl married a mountain man she'd never met, then found his demon temper was a lie. The summer Clara June Beaumont turned 26, she made a decision that her Aunt Dot called foolish, her neighbors called desperate, and Clara herself called the only sensible thing she'd done in years. She answered a mail-order advertisement. Not just any advertisement. This one had been placed by Reverend Hollis of Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory, a man of God who'd taken it upon himself to find suitable matches for the bachelors of his mountain town because he believed loneliness was a sin the same as pride, and he'd watched too many good men wither away on their slopes with no one to talk to at supper time. The advertisement read simply, "Mountain man, 38, honest trade, strong land, seeks woman of practical nature and steady heart. Correspondence, welcome. Reverend T. Hollis, Redemption Creek." Clara had read it 3 times. Then she'd folded the newspaper, set it on the kitchen table, cooked supper, washed the dishes, sat back down, unfolded the newspaper, and read it a 4th time. The man's name was Ezra Cole. By the time she'd heard the name, the stories had already arrived before it, the way stories always do in small towns and across the prairie telegraph of gossip and rumor. They said Ezra Cole had thrown a mule through a fence post in a fit of fury. They said he'd put 3 men on the ground outside a Durango saloon and walked away without a scratch. They said his temper was a living thing, dark and enormous, something that lived behind his eyes and came out without warning. The way a storm rolls over a mountain before you've had time to find shelter. Clara listened to all of it. She nodded in the right places. And then she sat down at the scarred kitchen table in the prairie farmhouse that had belonged to her dead father. And she wrote Ezra Cole the most honest letter she had ever composed in her life. "I am not a delicate woman," she wrote, in her careful, even hand. "I am wide where I am wide, and I make no apology for it. I have been looked at sideways my entire life, and I have learned not to require the approval of people who look at me that way. I ask only this, that you be honest with me, and I will return that honesty 10-fold. I am not coming to you out of desperation. I am coming, if you'll have me, because a man who keeps his word is rarer than a February thaw. And Reverend Hollis says you are such a man. I suppose we will find out." She sealed the letter before she could lose her nerve. Her Aunt Dot, a sharp-tongued, warm-hearted woman of 52 who had taken Clara in after her father's farm failed, read the letter over Clara's shoulder and was quiet for a long moment. "You know what they say about him," Dot said finally. "I know what they say," Clara replied. "They say a lot of things about a lot of people. They say I'll die a spinster eating boiled cabbage. I've decided not to believe everything I'm told." Dot had no answer for that. She hung her laundry and said nothing more, which, from Dot, was practically a blessing. The reply came 6 weeks later, in a hand that was blunt and spare, the handwriting of a man who had not written many letters and chose each word like he was paying for them individually. "Miss Beaumont," it said, "your letter was the most direct thing I have received by post in 15 years of trapping. I appreciate direct. I should tell you the stories about my temper are not entirely false, but they are not entirely true either. Half of them grew in the telling, as stories do. The other half, I own. I am not the monster they make me. I am a man who made mistakes, and who is tired, if I am being honest, of making them alone. Reverend Hollis will write to you with the arrangements, if you are willing. I am willing, if you are. Ezra James Cole." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and pressed it flat against her chest, and sat very still for a moment in the afternoon light. "Well?" said Dot from the doorway. "Well," said Clara. 2 weeks later, she packed a single trunk. Part 2. Redemption Creek. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a valley between two great folds of the Colorado Rockies, as though the mountains had cupped their palms together and the town had simply settled in the hollow. It was not a large town. There was a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a boarding house, a land office, a bank, and a scattering of homes that clung to the hillsides like they were afraid of sliding down. In October, the aspens turned gold, and the whole valley burned with it. In February, the snow came up to the windowsills. Clara arrived on a Wednesday morning in late September, riding in the back of a freight wagon with her trunk and her composure both intact. She had been on the road for 9 days. She had eaten hard bread and dried meat, and slept in a way station that smelled of horse and old smoke. She had not cried, not once, though there had been a long night somewhere in the Kansas flatlands when the darkness pressed in close, and she had allowed herself the small, private act of being afraid. But the morning had come, as mornings do, and she had watched the land change from flat to rolling to mountainous, and by the time the wagon rolled into Redemption Creek, she had set the fear aside and replaced it with the same practical steadiness that had carried her through 26 years of being the wrong size in other people's eyes. She climbed down from the wagon unassisted, nobody offered, and set her boots in the mud of the main street and looked at the town with level eyes. Ruth McCallan, who owned the boarding house and served as the town's chief archivist of other people's business, watched from her porch with her arms folded. Beside her stood Silas Vance, the town banker, whose suit was too fine for a mountain town and whose smile was the kind that never quite reached the eyes. He was a handsome man, in the way that certain cold things are handsome, sharp and polished, and deeply untrustworthy. "That must be the woman Ezra Cole sent for," Ruth murmured. Silas looked at Clara, at her wide frame, her plain dress, her no-nonsense boots, and the smile on his face thinned to something worse than a sneer, something calculating. "Miles from home," he said softly, "with no one to turn to." Clara picked up her own trunk, walked through the mud to the church, and didn't look back at either of them. Now Ezra Cole was sitting in the last pew of Redemption Creek's small church, turning his hat in his hands the way a man does when he's trying not to run. Clara saw him before he saw her. She had a moment to take him in. The breadth of his shoulders, the dark beard, the jaw with its old scar, the way he sat with his big frame compressed like he was always aware of taking up too much space. He was enormous, and he held himself like he knew it, and like knowing it had cost him something. Then he looked up. His eyes were dark brown and direct, and they traveled over her, all of her, without the usual flicker of contempt or pity that she had learned to watch for. He stood, because his mother had raised him to stand when a woman entered the room. "Clara June Beaumont," he said. His voice was low and careful, but the voice of a man who had learned to keep the volume down. "That's right," she said. The silence that followed filled the whole church, pressed against the windows, rose up to the raftered ceiling. Reverend Hollis, hovering near the altar, wisely said nothing. "You're smaller than I pictured," Ezra said finally. Clara raised one eyebrow. "In your letters," he said quickly, "you seemed larger than life. I thought you'd be 8 feet tall." The corner of Clara's mouth moved, just slightly. "Give me time," she said. They spoke outside the church before the vows, standing on the step in the mountain air with the aspens rattling gold overhead. Ezra told her, without ceremony, that the stories about his temper were not invented from nothing, but that they had grown far beyond the truth of them. He told her there had been one night, 3 years ago, that had seeded most of the legend. A confrontation at the land office over his younger brother Hank's deed, with a man named Silas Vance at the center of it. He told her he hadn't been polite about it. "Did the land stay with your brother?" Clara asked. "Yes." "Then it sounds less like a demon temper," she said, "and more like a brother who showed up." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then Clara told him what he needed to know about her, that she was not easy to look at, that she knew it, that she was not looking for pretense, that she wanted a partner, not a performance, that she would work without complaint and expect respect in return, and that if those terms suited him, the Reverend was waiting inside. Ezra put his hat back on. "It suits me," he said. The ceremony was brief and plain. Ezra placed a wide silver band on her finger. His hands were rough and large and faintly trembling, though she pretended not to notice. They said their vows evenly, like people making a serious promise, which is exactly what they were doing. Outside, Ruth McCallan watched through the church window. Silas Vance was not watching. He was already at his desk, already thinking. Part 3. The Cabin on the Mountain. Ezra's cabin sat on a slope above the town, in a clearing that looked out over the valley and the mountains beyond. It was a rough place. Solid walls, a good roof, a woodpile stacked with the thoroughness of a man who understood winter. But it had the particular bareness of a house that had never had a woman in it. A single shelf of tools, a table with one chair, a hearth that worked but never felt welcoming. Clara stood at the door with her trunk and looked at it for a long moment. "It's not much," Ezra said. "It's more than I had," she said, and carried her trunk inside. By the first evening, she had reorganized the kitchen shelf, identified where a second chair was needed, and cooked a supper that made the whole cabin smell like something other than wood smoke and old leather. Ezra sat across from her at the table and ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been feeding himself trail food for too long. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked. "My mother, before she passed." "I'm sorry." "She was a good woman," Clara said. "Hard life wore her down. I intend not to let that happen to me." He asked her how she intended that. She told him by deciding every morning that the day belonged to her and not to whatever trouble it brought. He turned his spoon slowly, looking at the table, and she could see him turning that over in his mind, weighing it, the way he seemed to weigh everything, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had once moved too fast and paid for it. He told her more about Vance that night, the full story, how Hank had been 20 years old and fresh to the land claim, too young and too trusting to understand when a deed was being quietly rewritten, how Silas Vance had come with his fine suit and his smooth voice and a document that needed only a signature, how Ezra had found out, how he had gone to the land office and said things loudly and done things loudly, and how by the end of it, Hank's deed was safe and Ezra Cole's reputation was in pieces. "Most people don't see it the way you do," he said after. "So most people aren't at this table," Clara said. It was not a dramatic thing she said. She didn't reach for his hand or offer him a soft look. She simply said the truth plainly and let it land, and it landed the way plain truths do, quietly and deep. Part 4. The Town and Its Stories. Clara walked into Redemption Creek twice a week for supplies and errands, and every time she went, the town looked at her in that way she had spent her whole life navigating. The sideways glance, the hushed comment to a neighbor, the careful studied blankness of people who had decided something about her and were committed to it. She let them look. She kept her chin level and her pace steady. And she learned the geography of the town the way she learned everything, systematically and with attention. Ruth McCallan tried, gently, to introduce the subject of a certain handsome widow out past the ridge, who had apparently set her sights on Ezra before Clara's arrival. Clara listened politely, asked if there was a question buried somewhere in the information, and, when Ruth flustered into silence, wished her a good day and walked on. Silas Vance tried a different approach. When Clara came to the bank to open an account, he offered her his smoothest voice and his most sympathetic expression, and told her that Ezra had nearly broken his arm once, and wasn't she brave, coming out here to a man like that? "Define a man like that," Clara said. He tried. She listened. Then she laid her savings on his desk and asked for her account, and the conversation was finished. She was not afraid of Silas Vance. She had met men like him before, men who wore their danger quietly, who profited from other people's uncertainty, who were always watching for the moment when someone's ground got soft. She kept her ground hard, and she watched him back, and she filed away everything she noticed the way another woman might press flowers between book pages. It would come in useful. She knew it would. What she had not expected was Hank. Ezra's younger brother was 22, broad like Ezra, but rangy where Ezra was solid, with an open face that showed everything he felt 3 seconds before he felt it. She found him sitting on a rock on the trail above town one afternoon, looking like a man whose dog had just died. He told her, haltingly, about Vance's visit that morning, the new offer on the land, and the suggestion that Ezra was distracted now that he had a wife, and that perhaps this was a good time to reconsider. The way Vance had a manner of talking that made you feel like you were the stupid one for not agreeing. Clara sat beside him on the freezing rock. She told him, simply and directly, that the land was his, that his brother had nearly gone to jail protecting it, and that Silas Vance was a man who existed entirely on the profit of other people's doubt. She told him not to give Vance the satisfaction of his. Hank looked at her with an expression that was half gratitude and half something more complicated. "Ezra said you'd be sensible," he offered. "Did he?" "He said, and this is exact, that you were probably the most sensible person he'd ever corresponded with." Clara absorbed this. Something in her chest shifted. Some very slightly, the way something shifts when a door opens inward instead of outward, and you realize you had been pressing against it in the wrong direction. She stood up, brushed her skirt, and told Hank to tell his brother to come home before dark, because she was making a decision about the woodpile, and she refused to make it alone. Part 5. The Deed and the Dismantling. The crisis, when it came fast. Silas Vance had not given up. A man like Silas Vance never gave up. He simply waited and watched and moved when the moment seemed right. And so, on a Thursday morning 3 months after Clara's arrival in Redemption Creek, she and Ezra walked into the land office to find Vance standing at the clerk's desk with a transfer deed and the particular composure of a man who believes he has already won. "Your brother signed this morning," Vance said when Ezra appeared in the doorway. "Fair and legal." There was a beat of silence, and then Clara stepped forward, held out her hand, and said, "Let me see that." Vance blinked. In his calculations, Clara had not been a variable. She was the wife, the plain, heavy-set, mail-order wife from Kansas. She was backdrop. She was furniture. He had not once, in 3 months, considered that she might be a problem. He handed her the deed because he didn't know how not to. She read it with the focused quiet of a woman who had spent a lifetime paying attention when no one thought she was worth paying attention to. "This is dated yesterday," she said. "This morning," Vance said. "No," she said. "Yesterday." "Oh, which means it predates today's date. And it postdates the new Colorado territorial statute requiring a 3-day waiting period on sole occupancy land transfers. Reverend Hollis read that statute from the pulpit a fortnight ago as a notice to all landowners." The room went very still. The young clerk behind the desk went a shade paler. "She's right, Mr. Vance," he said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "The statute took effect on the 14th. "That's a technicality," Vance began. "That's the law," Clara said. She set the paper back on the desk with the precise, unhurried care of a woman who had made her point and saw no reason to belabor it. She told Vance, in plain language, that the transaction was void. The land remained with Hank Cole, and that any future document arriving at this office with an incorrect date would be treated not as a technicality, but as fraud, and she would say so publicly. Then she turned and walked out. Behind her, Ezra Cole, a man who had once put 3 men on the ground and split a saloon's reputation in half with his temper, said absolutely nothing. He didn't need to. He stood for a moment in the doorway and looked at Silas Vance, and what was in his eyes was not fury. It was something quieter, and, for Vance, considerably worse. Then he followed his wife out the door. Part 6. What was true? Outside, in the thin mountain air, Ezra caught up to her. He wanted to ask where she'd learned it, the statute, the dates, the law, and she told him plainly. Reverend Hollis read every legal notice aloud, and she listened, not because paying attention cost nothing. He looked at her for a long moment with that weighing expression she had come to know, and something in it had shifted. He told her he had to say something. She told him to say it. He said, before she had come, he had told himself this was a transaction, a practical matter, a woman who needed a situation and a man who needed a household maintained. He had told himself that feelings were not part of it. He said he had been wrong. She looked at him standing there in the mountain street, this enormous, scarred, deliberate man who had been made into a monster by a story, and then unmade again simply by being known. And she took one step toward him. "How wrong?" she asked. "Considerably," he said. "Then we have something to talk about tonight," she told him. And, for the first time since she had arrived in Redemption Creek, she let him see the full warmth of what she was, unhidden, unapologetic, entirely her own. That night, the fire burned low in the cabin on the mountain slope. Ezra told her that his mother had once said a man's temper was just his fear wearing a coat. She asked what Ezra had been afraid of. He said losing things. Hank, the land, any chance of something real instead of just survival. She told him then what she had thought when she first heard the stories about him, that she had seen 2 possibilities. Either the monster was true, in which case she'd know it quickly, or the monster was a story people told to explain a man they didn't know how to hold. And the second kind of man, she told him, she understood. She was, herself, a person this town did not know how to hold. And he put his arm around her then. Not gracefully. He was not a graceful man. But with the solid certainty of a man who has made a decision and intends to keep it. She let herself lean, just slightly, into the warmth of him. Outside, the mountain was vast and dark and patient, the way mountains always are, indifferent to the small human dramas at their feet, enduring through the winters and the thaws and all the long years between. 3 months later. 3 months after that, Clara sat at the cabin table writing a letter to Aunt Dot, while Ezra read by the fire in the second chair, the one she had insisted be added. "Dear Aunt Dot," she wrote, "I have been married 6 months now, and I have several things to report." She paused, listening to the sound of the fire, the wind on the mountain, the occasional shift and sigh of Ezra turning a page. "The mountain is cold, but the cabin is warm. The town still stares, but it has begun to stare with something closer to respect than pity, and I will take it. My husband has a temper that is nothing like the legend. He is stubborn as weather, and sometimes as hard to read. But he is honest, and he shows up, and I have come to believe those two qualities cover a great deal of ground. The demon temper they warned me about turned out to be a lie, or rather, a story that only made sense if you had never been on the receiving end of his kindness. The two men who know him best, his brother Hank and Reverend Hollis, never believed the stories. I suppose the people who actually know a person rarely do. I believe I made the right choice, or rather, the right choice made room for me, not with grand ceremony, but quietly, on with a plain silver ring and an honest sentence on a church step in October. She looked up. Ezra was watching her from across the fire. "I'm telling Dot you're decent," she said. "Don't oversell it," he said, and went back to his book. Clara smiled, full and real, the unguarded smile of a woman who has arrived, at last, precisely where she chose to be, and she wrote the last line. "He says not to oversell it," she wrote. "I will oversell it anyway. Your loving niece, Clara June Cole." Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall on Redemption Creek, soft and steady, covering the mud of the main street and the rooftops, and the long slope of the mountain, covering all the old stories and the sharp edges and the places where things had been broken and grown back again, until everything looked clean and white and new.